Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the first ever video game. What was the first ever video game? When and where did gaming begin? Well, I'll tell you. First, gaming is a billion-dollar industry. It's connected multiple generations of people together, and it is found all across popular culture. And the industry has been strong and thriving for the most part for around 40 years, with some slight slumps during the early parts of the industry. But it's a rich and lucrative industry. But what if I were to tell you that video games existed before there was an industry for it? That they existed before even most people had television? Well, let's get into that. Now, for the longest time, people typically believed that the first ever video game was Pong. If you ask somebody who's uninformed for most part of gaming history what was the first video game, they would say Pong. Pong was an arcade game released on November 29th, 1972 in the United States of America by Atari Inc. Though this was not Atari's first ever video game, as Atari had actually released a game a year prior called Computer Space in November and December 1971, when they were still under the name of Syzygy Engineering. When under the name of Syzygy Engineering, it was distributed by Netting Associates, though they changed their name the following year to Atari Inc., based off of the Japanese game. So Pong, commonly believed to be the first video game, wasn't even Atari's first game. They had 1 year prior. It's just that Computer Space wasn't popular due to it being too advanced for the time and the learning curve being too steep compared to the very simple and basic Pong. Now, what was the first video game? I'll give it to you straight. It was Stracey's Droughts, made in July 1952 by Christopher Stracey, who was an English computer scientist. The game was made in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yes, gaming is a British invention. British-made gaming. Now, the game was created at the University of Manchester on the Ferranti Mark I computer. Christopher Stracey was a computer scientist at the university, and his work on Stracey's Droughts, also known as just checkers. Droughts is the British word for checkers. A British person would call checkers droughts, and we call checkers checkers. Now, he began work on the game in early 1951. Sometime around February of 1951, he began working on it. Originally for the Pilot Automatic Computing Engine, though typically it's just called the Pilot Ace computer. Now, back in those days, everything was printed onto paper, so if you wanted to check the code, you had to manually check it after being was printed onto paper. It used to be a much more time-consuming and manual process, having to have it, as everything was all the code and was printed out on the paper, on the punch card paper, and even programs had to put in using punch card paper. And this made it very time-consuming. It took a very, very long time, and you had to manually check the code. Now, after some time of working on the computer, he was able to compile the prototype for it, but he found some errors in the code, meaning he had to manually go back and do it all over again. And that's how computers worked back then. And eventually, he decided to switch over to the Ferranti Mark I computer. After compiling the original prototype and fixing the errors in his code manually again, it had to be done by hand, and had to check the printed out code by hand. He eventually got it working by July of 1952, a fully functioning game of droughts, where a person had the board, got moving, and it was fully running on the computer all by itself. Now, in 1952, 1952 was actually a very, very close call with another game called Oxo. Now, Oxo was also made in the UK and in 52, but it doesn't count as a video game. Because first of all, it doesn't have real-time updating graphics. Neither is there really any moving in it. There's not much really actual moving in Oxo. And its controller is a rotary telephone. You have to get it work to actually choose where you want your spot to be at. While with Stracey's Droughts, you simply use a computer. You don't use any external stuff like a telephone, like a rotary telephone. It's all running on the computer. Now, an even earlier example is Birdie the Brain. Now, Birdie the Brain was shown off at the Canadian National Exhibit on August 25th, 1950. It was even played by comedian Danny Kaye. But what makes this not count as a video game even though you play against a computer and you're playing a game of tic-tac-toe against it, is that it's using light bulbs. It's not using a computer display, a video display, it's light bulbs. You're pressing a button and a light bulb and that shape pops up. It's not truly a game, a video game. It's an electronic game, that's for certain, but not a video game. Now we can go back to 1947 with the cathode ray tube amusement device. Neither does this count, as the cathode ray tube amusement device was merely a prototype, with merely a patent that was issued and granted, but was never built. There's no evidence to say that there was one ever built. And if you look at the patent prototype itself, you would have needed various overlays and covers for it to work properly. And without it, it would have really been much of a game without the overlays and covers. At least with the Magnavox Odyssey, which you needed overlays and covers, you could still play a game without overlays and covers. You could play Pong without the overlays and covers. You could play hockey even without it. It's just the overlay for hockey just provided more scenery. You could still play a game without it. But with this, you needed the overlays. So, Christopher Tracy's Draughts, made in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in July of 1952, was the first ever video game. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all. So we could thank the British for video games. Though even if you look it up, it would say Tennis for Two from 1958. This is simply not true. This is the first time a video game was ever shown off to the public. Prior to this, you've only been able to see one if you worked at a very high prestige institution like a university or a laboratory. But Tennis for Two was beaten out by Christopher Tracy's Draughts by 6 whole years. So if anybody ever asks you what it was, you say Christopher Tracy's Draughts, July of 1952, in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I gotta say for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I found it very informational. That's all I gotta say, folks. Bye. Have a nice time.